Today, we're taking a deep dive into a company that finds itself at a really critical inflection point, Hikvision. We're going to examine a strategic pivot that's generating some serious internal value, but it's happening against a backdrop of mounting external pressures. And as you'll see, the data tells a pretty compelling story of operational resilience meeting geopolitical reality.
So, let's get straight to our core thesis. It's this. Hikvision has pulled off a successful pivot toward high-quality, profitable growth. The proof is right there in the Q3 financials. But here's the dilemma. All that fundamental strength is running up against a hard ceiling, and that ceiling is being imposed by geopolitical forces. This is the central conflict we're going to dissect.
Here's how we'll break it down. First, we'll dissect that financial turnaround and pinpoint where the new growth is coming from. Then, we'll look at the core technology that's giving them a competitive edge. After that, we have to turn to the geopolitical risks that are putting a cap on that growth. And we'll wrap up by framing the huge strategic question this all leads to.
Okay, let's start with the hard numbers. The Q3 financials give us some really clear evidence that the company's strategic shift away from that old growth-at-all-costs model is actually working.
The story really begins with the top line. And if you look at the first 3 quarters of 2025, revenue growth was, well, let's just say it was pretty unimpressive. The year-over-year figure came in at just 1.18%. Now, if you looked at that number in isolation, you might think the company's stagnating. But that's really only half of the picture. Because, when we look at the bottom line, the whole narrative changes. This is where you can really see that strategic pivot in action.
Net profit grew by nearly 15% over the same period. This sharp divergence from the top line, that's the most important signal coming out of their recent earnings report.
So the crucial takeaway here is this decoupling of revenue from profitability. On one hand, you've got marginal top-line growth. On the other, you've got this really robust bottom-line expansion. It just demonstrates a very deliberate strategy to prioritize higher quality business over just sheer volume.
But honestly, the most telling metric here is operating cash flow. I mean, look at that. A 426% year-over-year increase hitting a historic high. That signals so much more than just accounting profit. It really points to a significant improvement in the quality of earnings and the underlying health of their operations. And you can see that reinforced in the solid expansion of the net profit margin too.
So that brings us to the next logical question. What's the composition of this growth? I mean, with the top line being mostly flat, we need to dissect the revenue mix to figure out which specific engines are driving this improved profitability.
We know the traditional domestic business has been facing some headwinds. So the question is, what segments are picking up the slack? Where is the momentum that we're seeing in these profit numbers actually coming from?
This breakdown from the 2024 full-year data shows us the structure. And yeah, the domestic business is still the biggest single piece of the pie. But look at this. The overseas and innovation segments together now make up the majority of the business. That's a historic shift in the company's revenue mix. And this data right here shows the dynamics. The innovation business, which includes things like robotics, is growing at over 23%. The overseas business is growing at almost 9%. These two engines are more than making up for that slight contraction in the legacy domestic market. This right here is the anatomy of the new Hikvision. So what's enabling this pivot, especially in that high-value innovation segment? Well, a huge part of the answer lies in the company's core technology, which is really acting as a kind of competitive moat.
It's called the Guanlan Large Model, and it's purpose-built for AIoT. That's the artificial intelligence of things, where you embed AI into connected devices. The key phrase here is multimodal. It combines data from different sensors, cameras, mics, radar, to build this holistic understanding of a situation. It's moving way beyond just simple object recognition.
The value proposition here is really threefold. First, that data fusion dramatically improves accuracy. We're talking false alarm reductions of up to 90% in some cases. That boosts efficiency. But second, and this is crucial, it enables what's called scene digitization. So instead of just recognizing an object, it can understand entire industrial processes. And that unlocks much higher value applications.
So we've established a really strong case for internal operational excellence. But now we have to turn to the other side of the equation, the formidable external headwinds that are creating a ceiling for all of this fundamental strength. And these external pressures are all converging. You've got direct market access restrictions, like the mandated end of operations in Canada. You have persistent risks to critical semiconductor supply chains. At the same time, domestic competition is heating up, while the broader macro environment is posing its own set of challenges. It's a lot.
This quote from an analyst's counterargument just captures the essence of the problem perfectly. The idea is that no matter how well the company executes internally, its potential for growth is now constrained by a hard boundary, one that's been drawn by international politics.
And this brings us to our conclusion, which really isn't an answer, but more of a framing of the central dilemma this whole analysis has uncovered.
Ultimately, this is the unanswered question. We have clear, data-driven evidence of a successful strategic pivot. We have strong operational execution. We also have clear and escalating external pressures. So which of these two powerful opposing forces will define Hikvision's future? That remains the critical question.